קם אדם בבוקר ומרגיש כי הוא עם, הוא מתחיל ללכת ולכל הנפגש בדרכו קורא ושלום.
Report to the cloud, it comes to your email. So shalom everybody, and thanks for humoring me to report this class for MERCAZ and Nosoti Olami. This is a lesson that I gave a long time ago, not so long, at Limud in Vancouver. And each time I teach, it's different anyway, so I don't know how to do the same class twice. But this is a class really kind of about me and my practice in terms of writing amulets and doing various different kinds of ritual. I title it Magic and the Rabbinate. And some of it's really autobiographical and personal. And none of it really is academic. It's really me talking about what I do as a practitioner and how I understand it. And it has been, over the course of a bunch of years, a fairly good piece of some of the pastoral work that I do. So I'll let you in on that. It was sort of me coming out when I was teaching at Rabbis Without Borders, and I was teaching my colleagues, is when I began talking about it and felt supported and felt a sense that I should probably share this. And partially because I think that post-Shoah, post-Holocaust, so much was lost, especially from European Jewry, that we don't really have in North America a sense of the folk religion. We don't really have a sense in North America of the kinds of rituals that primarily, our great-grandmothers would have done. Or you can't go to an amulet maker in Victoria, BC that I know of in a Jewish way who can do those kinds of things with you. And I want to talk a little bit about the tension that exists, right, between magic and superstition and kind of how I deal with it. And also talk a little bit about what I do and some of the underpinnings of how I got there. So that's what today's class is about. So there's a piece in Tractate Shabbat that teaches about burying placenta on Shabbat. So burying placenta on Shabbat generally is something that one wouldn't do on Shabbat. And you can't put it into the category of pikuach nefesh, of that saving a life is paramount to other mitzvot, specifically ritual mitzvot, right? So if someone were in need of medical assistance, if I needed to drive someone to the hospital on Shabbat, I would certainly do that. But the idea of burying a placenta, there's no saving of a life there. So the tradition has the idea that we know that in ancient times, both rich and poor women would do everything they could to bury their placenta after a birth. It even goes into saying that, wealthy women would wrap it in a kind of in a beautiful wool and put it into a box and then bury the placenta, and poor women would sometimes put it onto straw and bury the placenta. And the question is, well, why? And why get that permission to do that on Shabbat? What was understood to be a sgula. A sgula is a charm, kind of a magical charm. And it said that it was a charm because it would lechamem et avlad, it would bring warmth to the newborn. And it's seen as a kind of a magic, right? And it was understood as a magic of bringing warmth to the newborn because by placing the placenta into the earth, it was a deposit. You're like making a deposit. You're doing this little picadon that would bring life force and warmth to the newborn. And it's really connected to life force. So we know from a Jewish perspective that magic for the sake of healing was allowed. And I think that that's a kind of a powerful piece. And that was sort of one of the things that really moved me to want to move into this. Some of the issues that I have is that really, I think deep down, I see myself kind of as a rationalist. as much as I love mysticism and as much as I love teaching pieces of Kabbalah, I think that if I were to really define myself, I kind of see myself kind of as a rationalist, right? I enjoy reading about science. I enjoy things that have a level of objectivity. But something about this seemed to speak to me in a way that's not entirely rationalist, but I don't think that I buy into the sense of superstition, because I think superstition is really about manipulating. I think superstition is about creating fear and manipulating others. And I think that it's also an idea that maybe we can manipulate divine source by doing these kinds of acts. And I don't believe that what I'm doing has any kind of theurgy. It's not real magic. I don't believe that that kind of real magic is something that is good and something that's really accepted by Judaism and Torah. And I don't think it's real either, and I think it's problematic. I remember when I was a day school director, one of my teachers who was Israeli got called back to Israel because her father was very ill. And the family rabbi went to her and said, you know, if you start keeping the Sabbath and if you start keeping kosher, your father will get better. And it brought her tremendous anxiety, and she phoned me from Israel, and we talked, and I said, well, let's say you do that and he doesn't get better. What does that say? That we can't really make deals like that with God. It's too simple, and it is a sense of manipulation, and we really, we can't manipulate God. And this, I think, was actually just manipulating. This rabbi was just simply manipulating her. The other piece that I remember when I lived in Israel in the 80s, there was a horrible train accident. There was a school bus in Petach Tikva that was hit by a train, and many, many children died. And it was one of the worst accidents in Israeli history. And there was a rabbi who had the chutzpah, had the gall to come on and say that this happened because the parents of these children hadn't been checking their mezuzah, right? That on the mezuzah, if you read the Shema, it says, "Leman yirbu yamechem v'yamei benechem al adama," in order that it will increase your days and the days of your children on the earth. He had the audacity to tell mourning parents that because their mezuzot were not intact, this is why this tragedy befell their children. And I think that's really the shadow of having ritual and things that are a kind of sgula. This idea of sgula, this idea of charm, the way that I understand it is that it's something that I can hold that can allow me to remember the potential of God in my life and the potential of getting through a crisis, or the potential of the deep healing that's already within me and around me. Also, the word sgula comes from the root segol. And segol, if you remember when you were learning Hebrew, are the three dots under a letter that make the eh sound. But that three is the first point of balance. So a sgula really is something that gives us balance and should balance us. And I think the other piece that really became clear to me early on in my rabbinate many years ago is that liberal Jews have a hard time with personal prayer. I don't know too many people, if I go to do a hospital visit and they're not well, they're in the hospital, they're not in a horrible situation, I would say, let's pray. I think that would freak out most of my congregants. I don't think anybody wants to have the rabbi come and say, can we pray? But at the same time, I think we all want that prayer experience and that prayer energy. So I think that by having an amulet, by having something that can remind us of that prayer potential is really what I find most helpful. And I guess the piece that always strikes me is that I think when bad things happen to us, we generally go to that place of why me? And it takes a certain kind of practice and a certain kind of wisdom to go to that place of, well, why not me? Right? There's random shit in the universe and it falls on all of us. So what can I do? I can't really protect myself, but I can respond. And these amulets are not there to protect us. They're there to remind us that we can respond. and to remind us that there really is healing. And I think that I want to make clear that when I'm talking about healing, I'm not talking about curing, right? Sometimes healing isn't always involving a cure. Healing comes from the idea of becoming whole. It really is about a sense of shalom, a sense of wholeness versus that deep fragmentation that we have when we're not well. I also, I'm not going to go and grab it. You'll have to trust me that I have it. It's a thick book about this thick, and it's the Zohar. And I own a copy because I received a copy from a friend's brother. I own another copy of Zohar that's more academic, but this copy was given to my friend's brother in a huge shipment of aid that went to Haiti during that huge earthquake in Haiti. So my friend Bill's brother, who was in charge of organizing the aid that was happening in Haiti from the United States, received cratefuls of the Zohar to help these people in Haiti when what they really needed was clean water, and they needed food, and they needed to be able to have medication against cholera. They didn't need this book. This book was not going to really protect them. But I think that was the intention of the person who originally sent it. And I think that the group that really originally sent it, I think it was the Kabbalah Center in Los Angeles, I don't know if they realized the hassle that they made for the people who were on the ground delivering aid. So I want to go back to what I was mentioning, that I don't think that the folk religion, and there's a certain sense of wisdom in the folk religion and a certain sense of comfort and a place for us to really plug in and connect. That doesn't really exist so much in North American Judaism, certainly not in liberal manifestations or liberal expressions of North American Judaism. And I think that as a rabbi, I've always felt like it was my responsibility to not only give you sort of the elite version of religion in terms of, what do the rabbis say, right? Because if you think about, if I were to ask most of you, what is the most holy moment that you can think of off the bat in Jewish liturgy, many people will say Kol Nidre. And I love Kol Nidre. I love the pomp. I love the music. I love how it looks and how it feels. And there is something very beautiful about it. I think that it's something that we long for as the new year is coming. And it's a moment of beauty. But the rabbis originally weren't very happy with it because Kol Nidre is this annulment of vows, and you can't really annul your vows. And you don't want publicly to people to think that I can make promises that then I can just drop. And that's really not what's happening in Kol Nidre anyway. Kol Nidre, we're really letting go of the promises that we make to ourselves and the promises that we made to God that we can't fulfill and we never meant to fulfill. I think we all, maybe not we all, I can say I have in my life had times in the middle of the night when I wake up and I'm dealing with a difficult situation that I will say, God, if only you get me through this, I'm going to do this, this, and this. Sometimes I get to go to this. I'm not sure I ever do this, this, and this. And I know that it's an issue. And the rabbis weren't very happy with Kol Nidre, but the folk religion, the people, we won out. And we have this beautiful moment that I think brings us a sense of relief and release that moves us into a place of deeper connection. So the other piece in terms of rational Judaism, David Wolpe, who's a conservative Rav in Los Angeles, numbers of years ago, taught in a very big synagogue that, probably the exodus from Egypt may never have happened. We have no archaeological evidence of the children of Israel, of Bnei Israel, being in the land that we now call Egypt. But we have a story about Mitzrayim. We have a story about getting out of bondage. And I think about that as, it's not about, is it a true story, but it's more about, is it a real story? And real stories are the stories that bring us meaning and bring us together and help us create, I think, a worldview that we can make sense of and that we can find our own sense of shalom within. And I think that also real stories are there to teach us about our innermost parts of ourselves, right? That the idea that we can all be stuck in Mitzrayim and that there is a paradigm for liberation that happened for our ancestors that can also happen for each one of us as individuals. So I also know that in this sort of post-truth world that we're living in, which can be really hard, there still is that delineation between a truth. And I think when we talk about the truth is too big for any of us to handle, right? We get glimpses of truth, but we never get to know the truth. That stays in the realm of divine source. But there's personal truth, and there's objective truth, and there's anecdotal truth. And I want to talk a little bit about personal truth, because there's a few things in my life that I've experienced, and there are a few truths that I really hold. And they're truths that I know, and I don't just know it in my mind, and I don't just know it because it makes sense, but they're things that I feel like I know in the fiber of my being. They're truths that, at least for me, resonate on a cellular level. And one truth I learned as a really young man, in the course of a very short time, both my father and my oldest brother died. And I was in a pretty heavy-duty grief response. And, I think that as a young man in my, late teens, early 20s, I was probably due for some existential angst to begin with. And that and losing two people who were so close to me put me into a real spin. And it's a funny story that I've told numbers of times, but I was living in Jerusalem. It was a very rainy winter, and the winters in Jerusalem aren't that different from the winters here in Victoria, except we have much better indoor heating in Victoria than you used to have in Israel in the 80s. And my house was wet and damp, and I was cold, and I thought, I'm gonna go to the movies. I'll go to the cinema because it'll be comfortable there, and I'll watch a movie. So 1981, for some crazy reason, or 82, the movie playing in downtown Jerusalem was Zorba the Greek, which I think was from the 60s, right, with Anthony Quinn. So I went to see Zorba the Greek. And I went into the movie theater, and it was as cold and damp as my house, and there was actually a bucket a couple seats away from me that was gathering drips of water. And so we think about Israel. Israel sort of did this incredible leapfrog from being a developing nation to one of the most developed places on the planet. But I watched the movie, and the message I got from the movie was, when you dance with all your heart. And when you cry with all your heart. And I thought, if I'm going to deal with my grief response, which was kind of manifesting as a kind of a depression for me, I needed to fully experience the depression. I'm not recommending this to everybody. I don't know that it's a way to get out of depression for most people. It was just something that seemed to be how I felt that I needed to do. So I felt like I was sort of hanging on, like, to the top of that deep, dark shaft. And my concern was not that did God exist or not exist, because I think that before experiencing these depths, I had a relationship with God. For me, it was that maybe God does exist, but if God is able to do this to me, then maybe God has no worth in my life. And I began looking at the void. I began losing the possibility to see beauty in the world. And I felt like I was holding on to the lip of this deep, dark shaft, and I didn't know if there was a bottom. But Anthony Quinn told me to let go. And if I'm going to experience it all the way. And I did. And there was a floor, and I hit it, and it felt like it was the hand of God. And at that moment, I realized that God was the source of my deepest sorrow, and God was also the source of my deepest comfort, that it was all God. And I think that sometimes when we experience divine source in our lives, we experience God within that paradox. That I think that sometimes in the human experience that God is that paradox. And we know that from the words of the prophet Isaiah, which we say in liturgy when we say Yotze or vore choshek, God forms light and creates darkness, right? God makes peace, and then the line is God creates evil. That it's all God. That there is no just God of light, because there's just God. There is no duality in Judaism, really. And when we're looking at that sense of non-duality, I think sometimes we do have to experience God within that paradox. That the word norah, which is awesome, but awesome is also potentially awful. And it's all there and it's all mixed in. That in our world, I think as we experience the world, nothing is purely good or purely evil, right? Everything is this admixture. That's how we experience things. Like everything has a shadow because there's light. So the other piece that I think that is really clear magic, for me anyway, is the magic of listening to others, right? We say the Shema Yisrael, listen. But I think that there's the magic that we do for one another is that when I'm listening to another who's in pain and I'm really witnessing them, right? So to witness is also connected to the Shema, right? Because if you look at the Shema in a Torah, the letter Ayin at the end of the word Shema and the Dalet at the end of the word Echad, that God is one, they're big. And they spell the word Ed, which means witness. And I know that when I witness another who's in pain, and I take their pain and their words and I place it into my heart, and then I give it back to them because it's not mine and it doesn't belong to me, that somehow the toxicity of that pain is diminished. And it's this magical gift that we all have and that we all do. And we all know that when we're hurting, how much it helps to talk to another and to be witnessed and to be comforted. But I think we forget to see it as magic, right? We just do it, but we don't take that extra step to think, oh, there's real magic. And there's magic in caring and listening to another. The other teaching that I really use a lot, and I use it also when I'm writing amulets, is a really simple teaching about the archangels. And when I talk about angels, I'm not talking about hallmark creatures that are flying around with wings and all the various things that we think about angels. The word angel in Hebrew is a malach, which is literally a messenger from divine source, a messenger from God, with a specific role to play. And I think that all of us probably, if we look back on our lives, have had moments where we were in the right place at the right time, being true to ourselves and true to that moment, and we were an angel for another. And I think that if we think about our deepest and closest relationships, we can see how the archangels, and I'll talk about them in a moment, are acting within our lives also, at every moment, all the time. So the idea is that we're surrounded by these archangels, which are really just aspects of divine support, aspects of support that's always there for us, if we can tap into it. The idea is that on our right is the angel Michael, who's giving us comfort and love and care. And on our left is the angel Gabriel, who's giving us power and protection and empowerment. In front of us is the angel Uriel, giving us light, that sense of wisdom and clarity, the light of enlightenment. And behind us is the angel Raphael, who's giving us healing, helping us get to that place of shalom. And I know because I once learned from Dvorah why the angel Gabriel needs to be behind us. Excuse me, Raphael needs to be behind us. Because sometimes we fall back into healing. That healing sometimes happens in hindsight. And sometimes we need to be able to fall back into the arms of Raphael. And all of these angels, all of this angel energy connects to Shekhinah, to God's presence in our lives. And I know that sometimes when I work with couples doing couple counseling, I'll ask each partner to go off on their own and to be able to think about, how am I Michael for my partner? And how is Michael energy for my partner coming to me? How am I empowering my partner, and how do I get empowered and have that Gabriel energy? And that sense of Raphael, how do I feel more whole as a human because of my relationship? And how do I hope to have the person that I love in this intimate partnership? How do I bring greater wholeness to them? And I think that it's not just knowing that, but it's sometimes we need to invoke it to remember. Many years ago, I got called to hospice. I get called to hospice a chunk partially because my wife has been a hospice counselor for, I don't know, close to 15 years here. And I've gotten to know a lot of the people at hospice. So when there's a need sometimes for pastoral care, and they're not always Jewish people, I sometimes get called. So I got called, and I knew I was walking into a very complicated situation. It was a couple where the mom was devoutly Catholic and the father was really kind of secular Jewish, but had a need for a rabbi. And they had a 15-year-old daughter who was dying of bone cancer. And they called me in. I'd never met them before. The only thing I knew was that the priest who had come didn't realize that the patient was a young girl, thought it was a boy, using the wrong pronouns, really very, very sloppy, and everyone was really, really hurting and really, really upset. And I didn't know what to do, but I knew I just needed to go and just be present, because there weren't any words that I can give them that were going to comfort them. There wasn't anything else I could do but just be able to be fully present for them. But before I went in, I sang a nigun that invoked the archangels. And I held it in myself, and I came into the room. And in the room was this girl and her parents and her best friend. And my heart was open, and my intuition said, you know what? I'm going to teach you this nigun, this tune. And we just sang, and we invoked those same angels. And this girl who was dying of cancer, with what little energy she had, she began singing too. And her friend began singing. And we sang for about 20 minutes. And it was a moment of real clarity and connection and love. And it didn't come from me. I didn't know what to do. It came from looking at this nigun like an amulet, looking at this nigun as a way to remember and to hold that there's something else that's happening in our lives that doesn't always meet our eyes. And to remember that we have a certain kind of power that comes to us from divine source. And I know also that, you know, as I said, healing isn't always curing. Sometimes it is, and I think, God willing, it will be mostly when we need it. But I know that sometimes it requires a shift. And even when I talk about, you know, the efficacy, the effectiveness of prayer, you know, prayer is a reflexive verb. It's something that we're doing within us. I think that we got sold a bad bill of sale that God is some guy who sits up on a cloud, who pulls strings and controls the universe. Because I can tell you that that's not the God that I believe in. And I imagine it's the God that most of us don't believe in. I think that because we have this image, we have a hard time talking about God. We're able to talk about spirituality, and we're able to talk about and talk around things that have to do with God, but because we've been given certain kinds of God concepts that are so immature and so difficult. And sometimes we go back to being in grade 4 when we talk about God. It makes it a problem. We think about God outside of self versus the fact that each one of us is created in God's image. Each one of us is an emanation of the divine. We also have God within us. So the word prayer, tefillah, comes from the root pe lamed lamed, which also is about introspection and reflection. So I know that the Harry before prayer should be subtly different than the Harry after prayer. That if I'm really reflecting and I'm really seeing self, that subtle difference, I hope, would change my mazal, change my karma, and change my fortune. That the mazal that Harry before prayer was going this way, and perhaps the mazal for Harry after prayer, because I've changed myself, I should have subtly changed my mazal. I think sometimes that's how it works. And that sometimes just knowing that somebody wants to hold you in such an intimate way as to pray for you, even if it's far away, it has to have some kind of effect on us. And I know there's been numerous kinds of experiments that are done, and all of the experiments are showing that some level of prayer does change. Can't remember the name of the Japanese photographer, but there was a Japanese photographer who had the equipment to be able to photograph water exactly as it was freezing. And when he spoke words of beauty and kindness, the crystals of the frozen water, the crystals of ice, were symmetrical and beautiful. And when he yelled and said nasty things, they weren't so beautiful. I think that it's part of the magic that's in our lives and all around us. And for me, when I'm using these amulets or creating amulets for people, it's really just a way to remember. And that remembering that I think that God nudges us in the directions to be our best selves, to be our aspirational selves. And that sometimes looking at that amulet can remind me of that. So I got into magic in a kind of a funny way. I had my father's books. My father was a machinist. He was a specialist in tool and die. And I grew up kind of a pink diaper baby. I grew up in a socialist family. They were Yiddishist socialists. And my first Jewish education was studying baby Marx and learning some Yiddish as a kid in an after-school program at the place that we called the Kinderschule. But I think my dad was kind of the paradigm of the intellectual working class guy. He was reading Kierkegaard and Barth and was a machinist, right? We have this idea of the academic elitists or the intellectual elitists. I think we've lost that model of the working class person who's also an intellectual, who's also modeling lifelong learning. One of his books, which was surprising because my family was not at all religious, was a book by a man named Trachtenberg, and it was called Jewish Magic. And I picked it up and I read it from cover to cover. And some of the things in that book really struck me. And I read it when I was already a rabbi. So I had the skills to unlock the notes, to unlock the resources and the sources that Trachtenberg put in his book. And I would be able to go to some of his sources and read them as primary text. And that really is what changed for me. I mean, obviously there are things in there, like there's a book called Sefer Raziel. Raziel is the angel of secrets. And Sefer Raziel, for me, was almost impossible to read because half of the book is weird charts and all kinds of things that I can't possibly figure out. But a lot of stuff was things that I was able to at least understand some of. And I also want to say that I think when you move into mystical learning, right, the idea of comprehension and grasping is different. That I am usually satisfied if I can understand 60, 70% of a text. And if out of that 60, 70% of a text, it touches something inside me, if there's something that's really has import and something that really speaks to me, that's enough, right? I think some of it, sometimes in the world of Kabbalah, we're given like hints that we wind up going on, and it takes us on a wild goose chase to places that don't have any meaning at all, just to throw us off course because it was an esoteric, it was a hidden and a well-guarded kind of a learning. And as that's opening up for all of us, I think it's important to know, especially if you want to be a student of Kabbalah in any way, that you might not be able to understand all of it. And that's totally cool. It's not an issue. So I began studying. I mean, to give you an even, slightly bigger example of my family and sort of the religiousness that I grew up with was when I was 13, I wasn't supposed to have a bar mitzvah because that's what the bourgeois kids did in their synagogues, right? And we weren't going to have bar mitzvahs. We were going to have a graduation and have a barbecue, right? Because we were all, good kind of socialist-minded kids, socialist kids. But I really wanted to learn about the religious aspects of Judaism because it kind of spoke to me. Because my last class with my teacher, Fischel, who was a teacher that I really, really loved. He was the kind of man that I could just sit with for hours and learn from. The last class I had with him, he wrote Religion is the Opiate of Society, and told us this was an important teaching from Marx. And, and for me, well, if it's Karl Marx, then it's like, Torah from Mount Sinai. It has to be true. And then he wrote the Shema on the blackboard, right? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And I came into the class. I could read Yiddish, so I can kind of make out some of the words of the Shema, but I didn't understand what it was. And when I asked Fischel, what is this? He said, well, this is the most central prayer of the Jewish people. This is the prayer that Jews say before they die, and how important it is. And I asked him, well, what does it say? What does it mean? And he told us about the Shema. And I said, Fischel, what's true? What's real? What are you teaching me here? And he said, Herschel, as he called me, you're done. You're graduated. Go and learn. And that summer I went to a Mennonite camp because back then there was the Christian Clean Air Fund for kids from New York who needed to get away and their parents didn't have a whole lot of money. You can go to these camps in the Poconos or in the Catskills. And I went to a camp in the Poconos that was run by the Mennonites. And I had my first sort of spiritual experience there. And my counselor, this man named Wayne, who I remember to this day, he didn't say, oh, open up your heart to Jesus. He said, open up your Bible, open up your Tanakh. He didn't say the word Tanakh, but I had a Tanakh because it was the first Tanakh, it was the first Hebrew Bible that my family owned because I needed to get one to go to camp. And that was a real beginning for me of moving into seeing that there's more to life than just what is meeting my eye. There's more to just the material world. So my first amulet happened here in Victoria. I think I was brand new in the synagogue as rabbi, and I had a congregant who was going in for really, really serious surgery. And I wanted to give her something. I wanted her to have something with her that when she woke up from surgery, she would have this piece of paper that would bring her comfort and strength. And I created a process for myself, which is to sit and meditate, thinking deeply about the person who I'm writing an amulet for, and then going into the book of Psalms and going into Bible and finding verses, finding psukim that speak to me and writing them out, and then spending some more time thinking about how am I going to arrange this on the paper for them. I am not an artist. in a sense of being a fine artist. My art is more like the art of a kid in grade 3 or grade 4, but I do my best to make something that to me has as much care and love as I can give. And really that's all that the amulet is just a gift of care and love that they can look at and remember that there's care and love, and that care and love is connected to God and God's chesed, God's kindness. And then I experienced the tragic death of a child as a young rabbi. And I felt when I worked with this family that I needed to do something. And once upon a time, and I know because I've taught you guys talked a little bit about this in the recent past, was that I had a relationship with a Hasidic rabbi, Rabbi Twersky, who's a descendant of the Me'or of Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl. And I knew that he had this ritual of putting the evil eye on trial to rid someone of ayin hara. And what is evil eye? I'm just looking at the time really fast. I have enough time. Evil eye is really that sense of the negative energy that envy and jealousy causes. That when you look at what another person has, and you looking at that person and that item that they have that they might even treasure with jealousy and envy, you're bringing bad energy to them, right? And I know even in my family, because my grandmother, who was not a religious woman, right? I just told you a little bit about my non-religious family. You know, she would look at a new baby in the family. She'd be, oh, such an ugly baby. How did you have such an ugly baby, right? And everything was tfu, 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 right? And keeping away the evil eye. Because I think that folk religion has been with us and is even with us, those of us who aren't connected to elite religion, that are not connected to regular synagogue life. We still have that need to plug in somewhere. And a little bit of an aside, but when you look in Torah at all of the various hardware that goes into the building of the Mishkan, goes into the building of the tabernacle, the place that gets built for God to dwell within us, that the word for socket, right, a thing that you plug into, is called an Adon. Sounds like Adonai, one of our special names for God, right? That sense of the socket. So I wanted to do something for this woman. And I created a ritual where it wasn't that we were putting the evil eye on trial so much, but we created a Beit Din, right? We had 3 people sitting as a rabbinic or religious court. They weren't all rabbis, they were just people who were close to her. I told her, I wanted you to bring people who are close to your heart. And we sat on the bima in the synagogue. I opened up the ark and I called on God. I called on all of us to open our hearts and to hear this woman's story and to listen with great care and to really witness. And then using our power as a group to help her feel like she could clear the evil eye and clear the bad energy that she has, because that wasn't the only tragedy that befell her and has befallen her family. And I can't tell you that magically things got lifted, but I can tell you that she felt relief and support and care. And that was probably a decade ago. And of course, small bad things have befallen her family, but nothing so big and so tragic. And nothing so big and so tragic that they can't get through it. And I think having those kinds of small rituals are a way for us to really gather the power that we already have and gather the energy that's always with us to help us. There was a period of time a few years ago where a number of soldiers who had served in Afghanistan had found me. I don't remember how they found me. If they found me because I'm a rabbi and because I was a soldier in the IDF, I was a combat medic in the paratroopers during the first Lebanon war. Interestingly enough, I felt like it wasn't going to be about hearing the story again. They didn't need to tell the stories of trauma that they experienced because it was just bringing the trauma back up. But I wanted to be able to move that trauma into a kind of a ritual to begin letting go. And we created a ritual based around one soldier's story. He was an older soldier. He didn't fight in Afghanistan. He was in the battles that happened in Cyprus, and the Canadian Army was there, I think, as a peacekeeping force, but they wound up having horrible things happen and seeing horrible things happen. And he was injured and got sent to Israel as the closest hospital that could handle his injuries. There happened to be a terrorist attack when he was there, and as they were wheeling a gurney by, it was a young girl who had been horribly injured in a terrorist attack. So he had experienced trauma on top of trauma. And we created together a ritual. And I brought him to our cemetery, and we did a little bit of a ritual. And he placed a stone on the grave of someone who died, who was a young woman when she died. Happened to be a young woman who died in the 19th century, but that wasn't important. And I think by having this ritual, not only did he have a sense of release, and I'm not saying I cured anybody's PTSD, because that certainly didn't happen, but the other soldiers, by seeing him experience release, they all had some level of release. So for me, all of this stuff is just having a reminder and a metaphoric grip that we can be open to possibilities, and that I can focus on God and God in the universe. And I think that by having an amulet or by having a ritual, I'm able to gain permission to go to that place. So I think sometimes we're afraid to pray. And sometimes we feel like we need permission to pray. And I'm not talking about liturgical prayer. I'm talking about deep prayer, the deep prayer that's in our heart and in our soul. And then I think it's really easy to forget that we're an emanation of God, and that our soul comes from that place. It teaches in our tradition that our soul comes from the Kisei HaKavod, the throne of glory, the throne of honor, right? Straight from God. If that's the case, then our soul is always in prayer and always in connection with God. And I just have two stories that I want to tell, because I think that to me they're important and kind of foundational stories. And I learned them many, many years ago when I was living in Jerusalem. So when I was living in Jerusalem, there was an urban myth. And I think urban myths, like all stories, maybe it's not true, but it's certainly real. It was the beginning when baby monitors first came out. Sorry. And when baby monitors first came out, there was this one religious family, and they had a 3.5, 4-year-old girl and a baby. And the minute this baby was born, the 3.5-year-old sister kept saying, I need to speak to the baby. I need to be alone with the baby. And the parents were really worried. Whoa, are you going to hurt the baby? Like, you don't want to leave her alone with the baby. She's only 3.5. How are we going to do this? And they realized, well, we have a monitor. So they left the monitor in the room. And this little girl went up to her sister, and she whispered at her, and she said, tell me about God. I'm starting to forget. Can you just remind me? And I think that's that reminder, right? Remind me, tell me about God. I'm so far now from that petach, of that place where the universe, where the heavens and the earth meet in that aperture. So we're going to have really serious barking in a moment if my dog realizes that the postie just came by. The other story I want to tell you, is also a story that I learned about from a woman who is a chaplain. And this woman is a chaplain, and she had been working with all kinds of people, and she herself had a daughter who had gone through multiple open heart surgeries from the time she was born until the time she was 6 or 7. And her 7-year-old daughter, Chino, her 7-year-old daughter said to her, I want to talk to one of your patients who's a girl. There's a little girl I know who's going in for an open heart surgery, and I should be the chaplain now and not you, Imma. And she was like, well, what is she going to say? What's she going to do? She's only a 7-year-old girl, but she said, you know what? I'm going to let her do it. So she went in and she sat on the bed of this girl, and her mom eavesdropped at the door. And she said to her, you know, I've been through this, and I know that it's really scary. And she said, and sometimes there's a time in the surgery when you're super scared and it feels like you're floating up. And if you feel like you're floating up, and if you get really, really, really scared, you need to look into the corners of the operating room, because in the corners of the operating room are your helpers, are the angels that will help you and get you through this. And my hope is that we all have something that reminds us of those helpers, reminds us of those angels. It reminds us that we can really make, there's really things in our world that ground us. And sometimes they're the things that are so close to us, the people in our lives, you know, the little tchotchkes that we have. Like, why do we all have tchotchkes all over? I should speak for myself. I have too many tchotchkes in my house. But I've got all kinds of little things around my house because some of them remind me of a moment in my life. Some of them remind me of a person. Some of them remind me of a connection that I can have with God. Right? And it says that when Jacob left the house of Lavan, he took with him his tchotchkes. He says, I think in Torah it's called pachim, these little cans or jars, but they were his tchotchkes, because those things, they don't have any power except to remind us of the power and the beauty that's already there. So I want to thank all you guys for letting me do this so we can send this out. And I'm happy to answer any questions if people have. I have a whole other piece, but it will take too long. So I promise you next week I'll tell you about spirit guides if somebody reminds me, because I've got a long sordid history of working with spirit guides that I'm happy to share with you as well. But any questions or anything, I'm happy to answer. You don't have to. But yeah, Susan.
I couldn't get into the room until 1:12. Am I going to get to see and hear what I missed?
You know, we're recorded, so there's no reason why you can't. So what you should do, Susan, is send me, rabbiharry@gmail, an email, and I'll get it to you.
Great. Thank you so much.
No problem. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I'm going to put in a plug for our Tikkun Shavuot. It's in the newsletter. We have some incredible teachers coming, teachers from within our own congregation, and a chance to do some sharing about lessons that we're all getting from this pandemic. And hopefully we're all going to stay safe. And what's Dr. Henry's thing? Stay safe, be kind, and there's one other thing I can't remember. But thanks for indulging me. And Shabbat Shalom.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. She's gone. Yeah, Susan figured out the, she's gone too. Anyway, it's good to see you both. Yeah. How are you doing? How are you doing?
Good.
Yeah, it's good to see you. What's that echo? So I'm gonna say goodbye. So take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
ולציון העלינו, והקם ברכה אלינו, צורי וגואלי, אלי שמעתכי נעתי, אדון בוחר נעתי, האל מגיני ומנעתי, כוסי וחבלי, בוקר ותשמע קולי, בוקר ותשמע קולי, בוקר ותשמע קולי, בוקר ותשמע קולי. בת יוסף מייחלת, הטוב ממך שואלת, מהר ארצה תהי נוחלת, מיד